Well, we are starting a new series this morning called With Jesus, and this is a series that's going to be in the Gospel of John. So the next 11 weeks in the Gospel of John. One of the four focuses of our vision at Union Chapel is to create clear pathways for apprenticeship to Jesus. And we can think about the Christian life in a whole bunch of different ways. We can think about it as maybe an eternal security deposit, like this is how I'm kind of punching my ticket to heaven, or we could think of it as a self-help process, like this is where I come to like work on myself and make myself a better person, a better husband or spouse or friend, how I learn to hopefully become a better parent or things like that. I don't know, maybe we can look at it through that lens, or we can see the Christian life for actually what it actually is, which is living a life of union with God and participating with Him in the reunion of heaven and earth. And this is what we kind of talk about when we talk about the mission that we believe that we're engaged in, even as a church. A life of union with God, participating with Him in the reunion of heaven and earth. And we believe that a life of union with God comes through being united to Jesus. And so we want to help identify kind of particular waypoints on the spiritual journey with Jesus. And so this is some of the language we're kind of using here to think about apprenticeship in our own community, what it means to stay with Jesus and become like Jesus, and acknowledging that many of us are at different waypoints along the way. We're not all in the same place. And what does it look like to, particularly as a church, to create spaces for the variety of waypoints that we find ourselves in? And so we've kind of broken it down into these categories of discovering, learning, integrating, renovating, and rediscovering, and so on. Because the Christian life is really not a linear path between one point where you start and one where you arrive, but rather this kind of orbit around the person of Jesus, of becoming more like Jesus and being apprenticed to Jesus. And so these are just kind of different places. There's not a hierarchy here of, oh, if you're here, you're in a better place. You're better off, you're a better Christian. This is just a way of kind of differentiating, like this is kind of the season of life I'm in. This is the waypoint that I find myself at. And so discovering is exactly that, is a place of going, I'm trying to figure out who this Jesus is. I'm trying to figure out, I have fundamental existential questions about myself. Who am I? Who is God? Is God real? And we enter into a place of discovery, of trying to find out more about God and ourselves. And so we've got some places coming in the life of our church that are going to be kind of aimed at people who are in that particular phase or that kind of at that waypoint. Learning is really just that, is probably more information-based, of going like, I'm in a spot where I need to understand more about God and what God has said about Himself and what God has said about me and my story. And so that's what that is. And the Story of God group is actually perfect for that kind of learning category. Integrating is less about information and more about formation. It's less about going, what do I believe? And it's more about how does what I believe integrate into the whole of my life? And as we interact with Jesus, particularly in the Gospels, we see that Jesus is not just interested in a part of us, but is interested in the whole of us. And so trying to create some spaces around that, as I mentioned already, like our emotionally healthy groups, is a good spot for that. And then we hit a spot, maybe hit a wall in the life of faith where we're like, I don't know about this. I'm kind of coming back to some of those existential questions. Going back here and wondering and questioning, and maybe it shows up as doubt, or maybe it shows up as woundedness or grief or pain or some kind of wall that we hit. And this is it's just a universal experience in the life of humanity. We're all going to hit this space at one time or another, and to say, what does it look like for us to be willing to renovate our spiritual house, renovate our theological house with God? What does it look like to create space for honesty and for sitting in the mess of some of that and trusting God in the midst of that to do some work of renovating in our lives and in our understanding of Him? And that leads us into this place of really rediscovery. And so our hope is that this might be a helpful way of kind of thinking about a life with Jesus and thinking about even how we're creating clear pathways here at Union Chapel for being apprenticed to Jesus. And you'll hear more about this, and you'll even hear these terms as we kind of talk about, like, this is an integrating group. And hopefully you can kind of put it in your brain of like, oh, I kind of know where that exists, or this is a learning group or a discovery group. So we're hoping that this is helpful. So here's the focus of this, though, and you'll see it really in the diagram. To be an apprentice, you have to be apprenticed to someone. That's the nature of apprenticeship. You have to have a teacher. You have to have a master. You have to have a guide. So that's what we hope to do in this series in the Gospel of John, is to stay with Jesus for the next 11 weeks so that we could be apprenticed to him. And as we see him in different situations with different people, we'll get some great opportunities to watch him, to listen to him, to learn from him. But we're also going to get the chance to see a wide variety of people: disciples, marginalized people, sick and poor people, religious elites, outcasts, skeptics. And we'll get to see how Jesus interacts with such a wide variety of people. And hopefully, as we look at these people, we might be able to see ourselves in them and be invited to experience and interact with Jesus ourselves along the way. That's the hope. So we're going to work through John's account of the story of Jesus, but we're just going to be focusing on these personal interactions that Jesus has with other people. So let's jump in. We're going to be in John chapter 1. If you got your Bibles, you can turn there. But I guess I want to start by talking about first impressions. The way we meet a character first really matters. It sets the tone for the whole story. And any good screenwriter or novelist who's telling a story is going to think long and hard about how a character gets introduced. I think when I think of first impressions, I think of like characters that live. Okay, they don't take up a whole lot of space in my brain because that would be really lame, because these are some lame examples. But when I think of first impressions, I remember the first time that I watched the first Pirates of the Caribbean movie. And this opening scene, the shot opens on Johnny Depp, and he's atop his ship, right? And you don't see the bottom of the ship. You see the top of the ship, and he's like sailing, like looking out across the sea, and you're like, oh, this is this captain, and it's like, the Pirates music, that very orchestral, theme, and then the camera zooms out, and you realize that his ship is sinking, right? And he's coming into port, and right as he comes into port, he steps off, the edge of the crow's nest, right onto the dock. And before a single word is spoken, we get a sense of who this character will be, right? And then the dock master asks him, says, hey, to park your boat here, you're going to need to give me a shilling. You're going to need to give me your name. And he says, how about I give you 3 shillings and I don't give you my name? And he's like, very well, Mr. Smith, and he takes the 3 shillings, and then as he's leaving and the dock master's back is turned, he grabs his bag of coins off his desk and puts it into his pocket and just kind of wanders off. And in such a short amount of time, we get introduced to this haphazardly confident, likable, conniving pirate captain, right? It doesn't take long. Or think of the first impression you get of Darth Vader in the Star Wars movies. There's this gun battle, bunch of stormtroopers shooting, these white hallways, smoke and lasers going everywhere. And then the shooting stops, and there's this low rumble, and this orchestral music starts playing the Vader theme, and this dark figure appears from the smoke, and all you hear is the This is pretty good. Yeah? I've been working a long time on that, guys. We got a new microphone for this very purpose. I was kidding. And he doesn't say a single word in that very first scene that he's in. And more than his black armor or his lightsaber, it's that breathing, right? That is always going on, that makes him ominous and dominating in every scene. And then you get James Earl Jones, really deep baritone voice to go with it. And it tells us so much about who this character is. He's scary and powerful and He looks kind of robotic, like he's got robotic parts to him, but that breathing reminds us, like, oh, he's in there somewhere is still some humanity, right? We get told so much about this character, like right at the beginning. These are film examples, but I think about the first time that I met my wife. She doesn't remember it because it wasn't that memorable to her. But we met in the college bookstore, and I was thinking about it last night, and it's like, man, how much would you give to like go back to some of those moments in your life? Like, I would pay some serious cash dollar money to like go back and like just observe that moment, right? This person that you're gonna like build, an entire life and family with, and like every moment of every day, and go back to that first time you met this person, and we had this amazing conversation, which she completely forgot. And so like a year later, we met again for the first time. I realized real quickly she didn't remember, and I just replayed I was like, well, that old one worked pretty well. Let's try it again. But so much can be told, and I remember thinking, like, this is an amazing person as I was talking with her. First impressions matter a lot. So ancient writers knew this as well as anyone, and John chooses his introductory words here in John chapter 1 very carefully. And let's just read them. I've kind of cut this up a little bit, and I'm skipping over a little bit to kind of condense, but you can just stick with me here. This is how he opens his account of Jesus Christ, his gospel of Jesus Christ. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. The true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. Glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. For from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, the only God, who is at the Father's side. He has made him known. I mean, this is quite the introduction. Quite the first impression. Other gospel writers start with Jesus' birth, telling the story of how he came into the world. John wants to rewind to the beginning of time and say, let's start here. Where was Jesus at the beginning of time? He was with God, and he was God, and all things were created through him. He zooms out to the grandest scale possible, and he says, this man that you're about to meet, let me just introduce him to you. He is the very Word of God. He was with God. He was God. Everything that exists was made through him, and in him is the life and light of human existence. And this man is like pure light, light that shines, and the darkness cannot overcome it. And this light, it's coming into the world, and some have received him and others didn't. But to those who did receive him, he makes them children. He makes them heirs of his kingdom. And then John says, if that's not enough, this Word, this God becomes, who was from the beginning, becomes flesh and blood and moves into the neighborhood and dwells among us, not above us, not underneath us, but among us, with us. God entered humanity to be with us. And he says, no one has ever seen God, but God has made himself known in Jesus, a breathing, heart-beating, hair-growing, bone and muscle-bound human being. God can be known. I mean, this is an introduction of like cosmic proportions. John wastes no time in setting the scene for who we're about to meet. Jesus, who we are about to meet, is the very creator God in flesh and blood. Makes me think of the genie from Disney, like when he's like, infinite cosmic powers, itty-bitty living space, right? And it's like, okay, this is going to be crazy. Like, John is really, really hyping us up. Like, if this is a theatrical score, which I think many of us kind of imagine, like, this is really majestic and like the grandest scale possible. And we're like, this is going to be a good movie. This is going to be a good show. Let's see where this goes. Let's meet this God-man already. Let's see what he does. Let's see what he says. Let's see what he's like. And then this is the first human interaction that John records. We're going to pick it up in verse 35. It's pretty simple. The next day, again, John, this is John the Baptist, was standing with two of his disciples, and he looked at Jesus as he walked by, and he said, "Behold, the Lamb of God." So John the Baptist, just a quick reminder, he's preparing the way for Jesus. He's preaching out in the Jordan wilderness. He's got a couple disciples with him, and when Jesus passes by, he's like, yeah, that's the guy. That's God's person. And then this is what happens next. The two disciples heard him say this, and they followed Jesus. And Jesus turned and saw them following him and said, "What are you seeking?" And they said to him, "Rabbi," which means teacher, "where are you staying?" And he said to them, "Come, and you will see." So they came and saw where he was staying, and they stayed with him that day, for it was about the 10th hour. It's a bit of a letdown for John's introduction, right? Like, we get this massive thing, and then it's like the very first, now we get, here's where the dialogue begins, right? The first part is the narrator, setting the scene, and now we meet the person, and it's like, well, that's about as boring a dialogue as you could get, right? With no great display of power, no moving discourse, no shock and awe here. This is just a very mundane conversation, especially because John did such a big buildup in the introduction. Here we have the creator of all things, flesh and blood, light overcoming darkness, God made known, and then, what are you looking for? Where are you staying? Oh, come and see. That's it. That's what John chooses for the first interaction. And at first glance, this is not the most riveting dialogue, especially since this is John we're talking about. John loves to write very full of humanity and emotion and depth and beauty. And so this first look just kind of seems blah. But it actually says a ton, and it beautifully sets the scene. So let's just sit with this for a minute and not pass it up. In these 4 short verses, the entire foundation of apprenticeship to the way of Jesus is set. Okay? So it's going to start here. It's going to start with the idea that Jesus gets to the heart of the matter with desire and longing. So, 2 disciples of John the Baptist hanging with John, and for the second time, John points out, says, this is the Lamb of God. And so 2 of John's disciples start following Jesus. And John doesn't say for how long that they're following behind. Are they stalking him? Are they just literally just walking behind him on a trail? Or have they been hanging out, watching from a distance? We don't know. They're following him in some way. And at some point, Jesus turns and speaks to them. And the very first thing that Jesus says in the entire gospel is, "What are you seeking?" What are you looking for? What is it that you're after? What do you want? Some of your translations actually might say that. What do you want? And it seems like such a mundane question, but it sets the tone for the entire thing. And so we get this contrast between the opening verses and this one. They're just staggering. The creator God in the flesh, the life and light of men appears, and the first thing he says here, at least in John's gospel, is, "What are you looking for?" God comes to humanity and asks a question. What do you want? God is drawing us into the internal conversation that is happening within us all the time. James K.A. Smith puts it this way. He says, "Jesus is a teacher who doesn't just inform our intellect, but forms our very loves. He isn't content to simply deposit new ideas into our mind. He is after nothing less than your wants, your loves, your longings. And so Jesus' first words are a question, and it's a pointed question. It's a question about desire. What are you really looking for? What do you want? And this seems like a really strange place to start, but it tells us so much about Jesus and what he cares about. It tells us that he cares about the heart of the matter for each one of us at a very personal level. What is it that you are after? Jesus understands that the cosmic struggle is actually rooted in desire. Kurt Thompson, in his book, The Soul of Shame, talks about how it was our desires that got hijacked in the Garden of Eden. It's our desires that got hijacked in the beginning. Our desires get twisted, and then shame gets put in its place. And maybe it's because of this that we live in so much shame around our desires. It's not really a thing that we talk about a whole lot in religious settings unless we're talking about like dealing with your desires, suppressing your desires, right? Pushing them down. This is what Thompson goes on to say. He says, because our yearning is the fuel shame depends on, let me re-say that. Because our yearning is the fuel shame depends on to ignite and keep burning, followers of Jesus can far too prematurely dismiss desire as a source of danger. We think we must avoid desire at all costs in order to keep away from the pitfalls of sin and the shame that accompanies it. Right? And so desire kind of becomes a dirty word. Like our desires are not something to be messed with unless they are just something to be suppressed. You want something, stop it. Right? You should not want that thing. And so in the context of faith and spirituality, maybe you've engaged it that way. Maybe you grew up in a religious environment that taught you to stay away from desire. Maybe you were taught to suppress any desire you might have because they're shameful. So train your mind and suppress your desires. But if there's anything we're learning here in the very first interaction is that Jesus isn't afraid of desire. In fact, he sees it as a doorway or a window into the most important questions about us. You know that feeling when someone, especially a teacher, asks you a question, you want to get the answer right. Some of you are teachers, and you have those kids that are like, they want to get it right? They're not going to raise their hand unless they have the right answer. When Jesus says, what are you seeking? I think it's a very honest question. I don't think he's looking for the right answer. And so many of us, when approached with this question, especially in religious settings, might know the right answer. Well, I know what the right answer should be. But we might actually be very out of touch with what the real answer is in our lives, with what it is that we really want. I know I've shared this before, even recently, but I think it proves the point really well. It's a story about a pastor doing a children's message at the beginning of the service. So he gathers all the kids forwards and he says, I'm going to describe something to you kids, and as soon as you know what I'm describing, I want you to raise your hand. So he says, okay, so this thing that I'm thinking of lives in trees, and it eats nuts. And none of the kids raise their hands, but he keeps going. He says, it's gray, and it has a long, bushy tail. And the children are all kind of looking at each other, but still no one's raising their hands. And he says, and it jumps from branch to branch, and it chatters, and it flips its tail when it's excited. And finally, one little boy tentatively raises his hand, and the pastor breathes a sigh of relief and calls on the young boy, and the boy says, well, I know the answer is Jesus, but it sure sounds like a squirrel. And I think this is what we do in the Christian life. We're like, what do you desire? Well, I know the answer is Jesus, but I really want a better job. Well, I know the answer is Jesus, but I really don't want to be alone anymore. Well, I know the answer is Jesus, but I would sure just like for my body to be healthy. And And so that creates more shame in us, right? As this place of like, oh, I'm supposed to want Jesus more than anything. And I know that's the answer. But there's actually these other things that I want. When Jesus asks, sorry, I think I got ahead of myself here. Yeah, when Jesus asks what are you looking for? What do you want? He isn't looking for the right answer. He's looking for the honest answer. Because when we engage with the honest answer, it will get us to the heart of the matter. Here's the thing about desires, longings, or even just wants, okay, is that they are layered. They're deeply layered. So when we spend a little bit of time with them and we peel back the layers, we eventually get to somewhere that feels pretty tender. Like, what do you want? Well, I just want a better job that makes more money. Okay, well, why? Because I want to buy a bigger house. Well, why do you want a bigger house? Well, so that I can live in comfort. Well, why do you want to live in comfort? Because I was raised in discomfort and abject poverty, and I want to give my kids something different. Okay, well, why? Well, because my home represented so much of what felt dysfunctional about my family, and everything about it felt insecure, and we were always scraping by, and we were never knowing if we'd be able to stay in the same place, and everything was so out of control, and I just want to feel secure and safe and loved, and I want to give that to my kids. And it's like, okay, now we're getting somewhere, right? You see how when we just pay attention to our desires, we can get down to some really fundamental questions about what it is that we're living for, what it is that we love, what it is that we want out of life. It's amazing when we sit with them, no matter, and honestly, no matter how shameful or selfish our desires may seem, when we peel back the onion, they will always lead us to the heart of the matter, to the deepest existential questions that we have. Who am I? Why am I here? Who is God? Does God give a rip about me? Am I loved? Am I safe? Am I secure? And so the question of desire gets us to the internal conversation that is always present, always spinning within us, and always moving and animating who we are in the world. And so apprenticeship with Jesus always draws us into the heart of the matter. And so the God of the universe enters flesh and blood and asks us what we want. Kurt Thompson sums it up perfectly. He says, but God renews our desires. This is what he's going to do with our desires eventually. And I'm skipping ahead. I get that. But this is what we believe. God renews our desires while using them to renew everything else, beginning with us. God's utter, joyful desire is for us to be with him and he with us, such that we might together create beauty in the world. God's desire calls to ours and breathes life into the lungs of the world. Here we are confronted with a deep paradox. It's desire the evil exploited, inserting shame in its place, yet desire is the very substance of our created being to which God is calling. He is calling out our desire in order to redeem it and make it the leading edge of the renewal of all things. God knows we are people of desire and longs for us to name our longings so that we can get on with the business of living together in his kingdom of beauty, goodness, and joy. So apprenticeship starts with this question: what do you want? This is what God is going to use. This is his leading edge of the renewal of all things. He isn't afraid of our desires. Why? Because he's confident in where they'll lead. And we're going to see this appear very quickly here in the Gospel of John. He's going to say exactly who he is and who he is in relation to our longings. So that's what he does first. He asks this question. Next, he invites. So Jesus says, what is it that you want? Notice the answer is not mind-blowing, right? They're not like, well, I've sat and reflected on this deep question, and I've decided that what I want is security, and they're just like, we would like to know where you're staying. We'd like to know where you are. They give him their honest answer in the moment. Can we hang out? Are you accessible? Are you available to us? Can we find out more? And Jesus says, yeah, come along. Let's just remember the setting here. Chapter 1, this is the God of the universe taking on flesh and blood, all the rights and privileges of the divine. And if there's anything we know about fame and power and status, it usually means just inaccessible. That's how we think of it. My daughter and my wife went to the Thorns game last night, and and it was sold out, like rivalry game against Seattle, and Ruby made this, homemade poster, this, Let's Go Thorns poster, and they knew they were going to be sitting close enough to that spot where the players all walk out and leave, and hoping like somebody will come and sign the poster, right? Bring the Sharpie along. And she went out and wait, hoping that they would come over, and they were just exhausted. They were all beaten, just went straight, just made a beeline for the locker room. And this is what we're used to with power and status and celebrity. We're used to a sense of inaccessibility, right? Like, I could never get close enough. In fact, we love to talk about our experiences of personally for me, is I shook Barack Obama's hands. No, not his hands, just a hand. And that'd be weird if I was like, both hands. And they're really soft, you guys. Really. He definitely moisturizes. But we love to talk about these moments of like, oh, I got this close. Who's the most famous person you got? Because it's an accomplishment. Like, I got close to them. The more power and status one has, usually the more inaccessible they become. This is what has always bugged me about celebrity pastors, too. It's like, how can you pastor in the way of Jesus with your green room and your bodyguards, this craziness? But I won't go on about that. The God of the universe doesn't act that way. And that's what's so amazing about this thing, is that they're like, hey, we're wondering if we can just hang with you. Can we chill with you? Can we figure out where you're staying? Because if we know where you're staying, then we can come maybe stay too. And Jesus just says, yeah, come along. And so the simple desires of these new followers is just, we want to stay with you. This is the actual definition of a disciple. It literally means one who stays with. That's all it means. One who stays with. Dallas Willard says it this way. He says, an apprentice is simply someone who has decided to be with another person under appropriate conditions in order to learn to do what that person does or to become what that person is. And this is all they're asking for. Can we come be near you and learn from you and see what you're all about? When we come honestly to Jesus, the response from Jesus is always invitation. Always invitation. Come. So there's always invitation, but what is the invitation to? Which brings me to my last observation. Jesus invites us to experience. He says, what does he say? Not just come. Yeah, sure, come along. He says, come and you'll see. You want to know where I'm at? You want to know what I'm like? You want to know? Come and see for yourself. Come and see for yourself. We can learn a lot by what Jesus doesn't say here. He doesn't say, come and learn. Come and listen to all the things that I'm going to say. Right? This isn't about just an intellectual exercise. You're more than a brain on a stick. And Jesus realizes that. And he doesn't say, come and believe. So this isn't just about an expectation of faith. It's not a faith exercise. You're more than just someone who takes just a leap of faith out into absolutely nowhere. Jesus invites us to experience him, to come and see for ourselves. He says, come and experience me with you. That's where we're going to start. Experience or full immersion into a situation is hands down the best way to learn from a master. Right? Some of you are friends with me on Duolingo. I love it. It's so so gosh darn addictive. And my wife can attest to this. As I'll like disappear, and then all of a sudden she'll hear like the little like Duolingo characters in the background, and I'll be like whispering like "Como se llama?" into my phone, you know. And they build this language learning app like a lottery game, you know, like they literally are just trying to wire, you know, like work with your addictive habits. But I love it, and sometimes I feel like, man, I am making some progress here. I am learning Spanish, you guys, and I am well on my way to being there. And then I hang out with my kids a little bit, and I hang out at back to school night. And my kids are in a dual language program. They've been in like Spanish immersion. Now Ruby's been in Spanish immersion for 6 years. And I get in there with her teachers, and they're just immediately like, blah, 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 and I'm like standing over here like, I know nothing, right? Like I could pick out a word or two, but I would never dare like try and like engage more fully with anything that I know, because it's terrifying, and also like I haven't been living in the real world of experience. Like as cool as it is to Duolingo, right? It's nothing like being thrown into a classroom and all your teacher is doing is talking Spanish, and half of your friends in your class are native speakers, and so they're speaking Spanish with you, and it's kind of like sink or swim. Like you just got to figure it out. This is how you're going to do it. You're going to be immersed in a full-fledged experience. This is the invitation of God and Jesus, not just to come and learn, here's your Duolingo app, but come and see, come and immerse yourself in relationship with me. And it's in this context that we can be truly apprenticed to Jesus. He invites us to come and experience. So these are the three things. And as we imagine ourselves, just for a moment, in this place this morning, how is it that we can engage with Jesus? And this is where I want to end. First, we engage with Jesus by engaging our desires in conversation with Jesus. What do you want? Do you know what you want? For some of us, this question and the answer to this question is buried so deeply under so much stuff. It's going to take some time. Can you begin an honest conversation with Jesus about your desires? And this it's going to take something. This isn't just going to happen to you. Reflecting on your desires is not just going to be like you're sitting in the grocery store and you're like, oh, there it is. This takes intentionality. This takes silence and solitude. This takes sitting with your thoughts, all things that we're deeply uncomfortable with for the most part in our culture. This takes creating some space. Peel back the onion as much as you can. You don't know what you want? Start by writing the first thing that comes to your mind. And then try peeling back the onion. What's the longing underneath the longing? What's the longing underneath the longing underneath the longing? And get down to what feels like the most fundamental questions of your life. The beauty of this is that Jesus just isn't afraid of this conversation. And so that should give us some sense of comfort. We shouldn't be either. And you're like, no, I don't think I want to touch this one because this leads me to a place of shame. And I would say, dig underneath the shame. Be honest about what it is that you desire, and then go, what's underneath that thing? What are underneath the desires that you think might even be displeasing to God? Can you engage a conversation with Jesus around your desires? And so maybe that looks like journaling. Maybe that looks like a day away. Maybe that looks like being intentional. But if we're getting serious about what does it mean to be apprenticed to Jesus, this is a fundamental question for us to begin with. And we have to create space for it. Come as honestly as you can. Second, take Jesus up on the invitation. If you want to go deeper, the invitation of Jesus is for you. God is accessible and available. If there's anything that we see and learn from the person of Jesus Christ, it is that God has become accessible. God has come near. God is inviting us in. This is not the only time Jesus says, come. I'm not just like ripping this out of the Gospels. He's like, oh yeah, come and see. Come all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. He's constantly saying, yeah, come and follow me. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. God has come near, and God is inviting you in. God shows up in flesh and blood, and his posture is not the posture of a closed-off celebrity or a distant divinity. It is the surprising and wonderful posture of a warm invitation. And what is it about invitation, though, that who doesn't love a real, sincere, genuine invitation? When someone's like, I'd love to spend some time with you. What an amazing thing if we have just a sliver of desire for God and to be with God, to know that what we might possibly be met with in that space is a God who says, oh, I'd love to be with you. I'd love to spend some time with you. We love to feel invited because it intimately says, you are of value and you are of worth. And I want to be with you. In fact, this is how most friendships are formed. Go back and think about your friendships, your deepest friendships. They probably started with some sort of invitation. Hey, do you want to hang out with us? We're just playing some games tonight. I know people who've met their spouses that way, right? Just with simple invitations. The God of the universe has an open door policy. Come and be with me. And so what does it mean for you in your life, in this moment, to respond to the invitation of Jesus? And you're like, I've been walking with Jesus for a long time. How do you engage this question in a new way for your own self? What does it mean that Jesus is saying, yeah, I'd love to be with you? What does that look like for you? And then third, come and experience. The invitation of Jesus is into an invitation, or is into experience, to be fully immersed in connection with God. That sounds great. How do we do that? How do we experience the life of God? Well, I think there's a whole bunch of ways we can experience the life of God. We're doing it here. We can pay attention to the life and words of Jesus as recorded. We can participate in this sacrament together, which is an experience in and of itself. We can stay in community with the people of God. We can stay attuned to God, to ourselves, to each other. But more than anything, I think I would say, we can simply just pay attention to our lives. To see our own lives as the playground in which we experience God. As everything as an opportunity for engaging with Jesus in what we're doing. And when we do this, we discover that my story is held in our story, which is held in the story. And we engage all of our experience at all of those levels, that my personal story is intertwined with our story, as whatever that our is. It's your family or it's this community, that we share something together, and that story is fully encompassed within the story that God is telling in the world. Every level of our life and experience matters, and as we immerse ourselves in our daily lives and pay attention, we can ask, how is God inviting me to find myself in that story? How is God inviting me to experience his life in this place here and now? And there's opportunity for all of that to come alive. So that's what I would leave you with this morning. This is a great place to start. the conversation of apprenticeship. That Jesus is engaging our desires in conversation. He's inviting us in, and he's inviting us to experience him in his life. In a moment, we're going to share this table together, but this morning also, we're going to have some people available to pray with you. And they'll be in the back corners. And also, Alyssa, who's our deacon of prayer, will be in the hallway if you're looking for a quieter place as well. But I think this is what I would say to you. Maybe, here's a couple potential places you might be. Maybe you're in a place of distress and you're carrying too many burdens right now to even feel like you can come at the conversation of what do I want. And that's okay. That's okay. The beautiful place of being here and being in a place where we can pray together is that you can come and someone can walk with you in carrying those things into the life of God with you. So if you're in that space, I invite you to come and be prayed for. Or maybe you're in a place, maybe you are in a place of fear and trepidation and vulnerability as you ponder the idea of bringing your desires to God. Maybe it taps into deep places of, I don't trust God with my desires. You know, I was listening to another pastor this week talk about why God loved Job's prayers. And it's really interesting because Job's prayers were complaining and he was frustrated and he was angry, and yet God says, Job has honored me in his prayers. And how is it that Job's prayers were honoring to God? Well, they were a conversation with God. God was like, this honors me. Like, Job, you brought me all of your frustration and all of your anger and all of your doubt and all of these, your fear and your trepidation. So this isn't about getting it right. You know, I don't know how many times I wish I had a quarter for every time I heard a pastor say, do you need to get right with God? Wrong question. Wrong question. Like, that is not what Jesus starts with. This isn't about getting it right with God or getting yourself right with God. That's what he does. That's the work he does in you with time. This isn't about getting right with God. It's about an honest conversation. Bring your true self. Bring your true self, and this is where I'm at. Or maybe this morning you're like, no, I can already feel it and sense it. I can put my fingers on my desires, and I simply want to speak them in prayer. I simply want to carry them to the heart of Jesus with somebody else. So come and be prayed for. We're also going to share this table together. Jesus was no fool. He knew exactly what he was doing when he left us a tangible, real experience in order to remember him and experience his love and his forgiveness and his mercy and his very life and light in us. He said, take this bread and consume it, and take this cup and drink it. This is me. This is my body broken for you. This is my blood poured out for you. This is my life for you. And so Jesus, you want to experience the life of Jesus. This is a way that we do that every single week. Come and be immersed in the life of Jesus. His invitation is open. His presence is warm. And he's inviting you in. So the invitation's to come.